Those home DNA kits that can help you discover your ancestry are also being used to solve crimes. Once you submit a sample of your DNA, companies store that information in a database. After you get your DNA profiles, you can voluntarily upload your information to GEDmatch, which is a database that allows you to learn even more about your potential family members in genealogy. Curtis Rogers, the website's founder, says about 1.2 million people have uploaded their DNA profiles to GEDmatch. It has been the main database used by police for genealogy, involved in more than 60 of the cases solved so far. A survey published last year noted that more than 90% of Americans support the use of genealogy databases by law enforcement to solve violent crimes. Let me know in the poll above if you agree or disagree for the use of genealogy to find suspects. In Fulton County on May 25, 1997, when the father of 28-year-old Lorrie Ann Smith went into her bedroom to wake her up for church, he found her body shot in the back at point-blank range. There was no sign of sexual assault or robbery, but evidence was left behind that Smith struggled with her killer, who left fingerprints and droplets of blood in the home. Smith was a multilingual marketing specialist and also a youth counselor at the Union Christian Church of College Park. After running the DNA left at the crime scene through local databases, investigators hit a dead end, and Smith's murder was soon marked unsolved. Then 2 decades later, in the summer of 2018, a detective for Fulton County used Parabon Nanolabs on a number of cold cases, one of which was Smith's case. Parabon Nanolabs is a private company that scans public DNA profile records submitted through genealogy searches meant to help people find lost relatives. Parabon has been involved in solving a number of cold cases, including the arrest of the Golden State Killer. The new investigation on Smith's case led to the arrest of 61-year-old Jerry Lee, who, according to Smith's mother, had lived next door. Lee was a married father who was a corrections officer in Atlanta at the time he allegedly murdered Smith. The way investigators were led to Lee was from his distant cousin, who had been tracing his family tree and provided his own DNA. When the DNA from Smith's crime scene was tested through the database, the geneticists found similarities in the DNA strain provided by Lee's cousin. Police then figured out who among the cousin's relatives may have been living in the same area where Smith was murdered back in 1997. Those investigations led them to Lee. Police then obtained a search warrant in Alabama where Lee was living to take a DNA sample. Then, after comparing those samples, investigators were able to make an exact match that led to Lee's arrest. Smith's family issued a statement through the Fulton County Police Department, quote, "We have some relief. One chapter is closed, but there are new ones opening with trials, sentencing, and all that we will be learning about the next phase of the process," unquote. In Orlando, Florida, on October 21, 2001, college student Christine Franke was shot dead in her apartment. Even though DNA was left behind at the crime scene, and despite numerous attempts by investigators to solve the homicide, years went by without an arrest. 11 years later, a genetics company used DNA from the crime scene to generate a composite photo of what the suspect could potentially look like. Unfortunately for police and Franke's family, the release of that photo in 2016 did not generate any new leads. Then, in November of 2018, a suspect was finally arrested after police identified him through genetic genealogy. The family was shocked but relieved that after 17 years of not knowing, they finally had an answer as to who killed Christine Franke. Michael Fields, a detective with the Orlando Police Department that worked on Franke's case, partnered with Jeannie Moore, who was a genetic genealogist, and they first began by running the DNA left at the crime scene and found 2 relatives of Franke's killer who had submitted their DNA to the GEDmatch database voluntarily. Then, Moore and the detective reverse engineered a family tree where eventually Fields interviewed several family members, zeroing in on one woman who had 2 sons in Orlando. When asked to give a DNA sample to police, the woman willingly supplied it, and that sample confirmed she was the mother of Franke's suspected killer. From there, investigators narrowed their search down to one of the woman's 2 sons, Benjamin Holmes. Holmes, now 38 years old, was placed under surveillance, and after he flicked a cigar butt on the ground, police retrieved it and tested the DNA. That DNA matched the DNA left behind at Franke's crime scene. Holmes was taken into custody in November of 2018 on a single charge of homicide. He has entered a plea of not guilty and has denied having any knowledge of the murder or even being near the crime scene. Franke's mother says after thinking she would never find out who killed Christine, she feels blessed and grateful that everyone involved in the case never gave up on her daughter. In Seattle, Washington, in July 1967, 20-year-old Susan Galvin, who was a records clerk for the city's police department, failed to show up for her overnight shift. She was later found sexually assaulted and strangled in the parking garage elevator at the Seattle Center where she worked. Police questioned dozens of people, but a professional clown seen with Galvin a few days earlier stood out as a potential suspect. Investigators were even more suspicious when the clown quit his job a few days after, but he was never charged due to lack of evidence, and in 2016, the clown was finally cleared by a DNA test. Then, in 2002, there was a new lead found by forensic scientist Lisa Collins, as she was able to recover seminal fluid from Galvin's underwear. They sent it into the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab, but they found no matches. Galvin's case soon became cold, but then in the summer of 2018, police provided the DNA left by the killer at the crime scene to Parabon Nanolabs. Like the other cases, investigators began to work backwards to create a family tree for the killer, first identifying 2 distant cousins, which ultimately identified Frank Whippich. Whippich was a married man from Seattle and a former soldier. He died of complications from diabetes in 1987, so to be able to match his DNA to the DNA left on Galvin at the crime scene, the Seattle police exhumed his remains. When finally tested, the DNA was found to be a confirmed match. Whippich had previously served time in jail for a charge of larceny in 1971 and later was arrested for impersonating a police officer while armed with a gun. Police decided to investigate if Whippich may have killed anyone else while stationed in New York, Alaska, and Germany while in the Army. Frank Whippich was a 26-year-old security guard in 1967 when investigators allege he sexually assaulted and killed Galvin. Whippich may have even worked at the same building as Galvin when the homicide took place. He was also married and the father of a young child during that time. Jeannie Moore, the genetic genealogist, said, quote, "It's the oldest case where genetic genealogy has helped to identify the suspect," unquote. The Seattle Police Department presented Galvin's brother Chris with the United States flag that was flying over the Seattle Justice Center the day Detective Rolf Norton solved the murder of his sister. Chris said, quote, 52 years later, we learn the who, but still have no clear understanding as to the why. There will always be that lingering question," unquote. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, on January 7, 1969, 23-year-old Harvard graduate student Jane Britton was found dead by her boyfriend. He went to her apartment near campus to check on her after she failed to show up for an exam that morning. Britton was face down on her bed, with clothes covering her head and upper body. An autopsy showed she was sexually assaulted and was bludgeoned to death, suffering skull fractures so severe that her brain was cut and bruised. Britton was last seen alive by her neighbors on January 6th after a night out with friends. The case remained unsolved for decades, and after requests from the public, investigators took a fresh new look at the case. This included advanced DNA testing on swabs from Britton's autopsy, which showed a male-specific profile. Then, in November of 2018, Middlesex County District Attorney Marion Ryan announced that police investigators finally pinpointed a suspect in the case using the DNA taken off of Britton and data from the genealogy website Ancestry.com. After the findings, Ryan stated at a news conference, quote, "This is the oldest case that we have been able to solve in this office," unquote. When the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab tested the DNA from Britton's body, they got a soft hit on 54-year-old Michael Sumter, a career criminal whose DNA profile was in CODIS, which is the FBI's combined DNA index system. That match was confirmed when investigators found a DNA profile belonging to Sumter's brother in Ancestry.com's DNA database. Sumter's brother was cooperative with investigators, providing a fresh DNA sample, which, when tested, confirmed that Michael Sumter's profile matched both the original soft hit and the male profile found on Britton. Investigators believe Sumter did not know Britton, but he lived about a mile from her apartment in 1967, 2 years before she would be killed, and was also arrested and convicted of assaulting a woman blocks from Britton's home in 1972. According to documents on Britton's case, a witness reported hearing someone on the fire escape earlier in the evening when she was killed, so investigators believe Sumter got into her apartment through the fire escape. Sumter died of cancer in 2001, which was about a year after he finished serving time for a sexual assault from 1975. Since his death, Sumter has been linked to 4 other sexual assaults in the 70s by using DNA evidence, 2 of which resulted in the deaths of the women. After not knowing for 50 years who killed Britton, her family and all of the investigators involved in the case are thankful for the recent DNA advancements and are relieved the case was finally solved after 5 long decades. In Lakewood, Colorado, on August 25, 1981, Jeannie Moore left her home to head to work at a convenience store. Like she normally would, she hitchhiked that morning and was seen getting into a red 1970 Ford LTD or Galaxy that pulled over to pick her up. Witnesses said around 7:10 a.m. they saw her by the car trying to open the passenger door but had trouble, so the driver leaned over and opened the door from within. That was the last time she was seen alive. When Moore didn't show up for work on time, her manager called her mother. Then an investigation into her whereabouts began. 5 days later, on August 30th, picnickers found Moore's body in Genesee Park. An autopsy showed she was sexually assaulted, her death being caused by several blows to the head. Unfortunately, despite widespread media coverage and DNA being retrieved from the crime scene, Moore's murder went unsolved for decades. Jefferson County investigators took another look at the case in 2011 and submitted the evidence to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, where a DNA profile of the suspect was developed, but did not match any other profiles in the FBI's combined DNA index system. Then, in May of 2019, the county's lead cold case detective, Elias Alberti, revisited the case again after there was advanced development in genealogy and DNA testing over the previous 18 months. With that in mind, the DNA profile of the suspect was given to United Data Connect with funding from Crime Stoppers, where they submitted their profile to 2 genealogy database companies. Investigators took those results and developed a family tree, finding family members on public genealogy websites with similar DNA to the DNA in Moore's case and working their way back to locate a potential suspect. Finally, Donald Perea was named as the suspect who murdered Moore back in 1981. Investigators then were able to speak to family members, one of which was Perea's daughter, to get fresh samples of their DNA to confirm Perea was the suspect. Testing showed he was 3.3 trillion times more likely than anyone else to have committed the murder. Perea died due to health complications in May of 2012 at the age of 54. He was 23 years old at the time of Moore's murder and had been out on bond from a previous violent sexual assault during that time. He served time in prison from 1982 to 1985, but then also had other assaults in the 90s. Even though Perea wasn't able to be prosecuted for the murder, Moore's family was given some degree of closure. Her parents are no longer living, but her surviving family members describe their sister as, quote, kind and loving in all her ways, unquote. They say they hold no grudges and just hope Jeannie's story will remind others to be vigilant. Unfortunately for GEDmatch, they ran into some backlash after some questioned the ethics and legality of the technique. Even though GEDmatch discloses profiles could be used by third parties, including law enforcement, it is usually buried in privacy policies in terms of service, so some customers of genealogy companies may not have realized they were signing up to help with these criminal investigations. At first, GEDmatch's terms of service restricted cops' searches for suspects' relatives to investigations of homicides or sexual assaults. New terms of service were recently updated on their website, extending the crimes for which law enforcement searches are allowed to, quote, murder, non-negligent manslaughter, aggravated sexual assault, robbery, or aggravated assault, unquote. Also, a new privacy setting is now in place for users to say whether they wish to have their profiles made available for searches by police. By default, all profiles have been set to opt out unless users decide to opt in. Because of this, geneticists fear the number of solved cases will slow down in the near future. Where there were once millions of searchable profiles, 20,000 remained as of June 9, 2019. With advancements in genetic genealogy, there's no telling what the future holds and how many unsolved cases could potentially be solved. As more people become familiar with the exposure of genetic services, opinions may shift regarding the susceptibility of police access to the data that's generated by and shared with these services.